Number 1. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, the boys who wanted to commit the perfect crime. There are crimes that shock a generation, and then there are crimes that reshape the way an entire civilization thinks about youth, intelligence, and the darkest corners of the human mind, and the case of Nathan Freudenthal Leopold Jr. and Richard Albert Loeb belongs firmly in that second category. A case so extraordinary, so deeply unsettling in its calculated nature, and so philosophically disturbing in its motivation that nearly a century after it unfolded on the streets of Chicago, Illinois, it continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, legal scholars, and historians as one of the most important and haunting criminal cases in the history of the United States. And to understand what these two young men did on the afternoon of May 21, 1924, one must first understand who they were, where they came from, and what combination of privilege, intellectual arrogance, and profound psychological dysfunction ultimately led them to take the life of a 14-year-old boy for no reason other than the cold and calculated belief that they were superior human beings who could get away with anything they chose to do. Nathan Leopold was born on November 19, 1904, into one of the wealthiest and most socially prominent families on Chicago's South Side, his father having built a considerable fortune in the freight and shipping industry, and Nathan himself was by any academic measure a prodigy of the highest order, fluent in multiple languages before most boys his age had finished reading their first novel, a published scholar in the field of ornithology, and a student accepted to the University of Chicago at an age when most young men were still navigating the social pressures of secondary school, and his intelligence was not merely above average but the kind of rare and almost unsettling brilliance that set him apart from virtually everyone around him, a brilliance he would ultimately weaponize through a deeply distorted reading of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, whose concept of the exceptional individual existing beyond the moral constraints of ordinary society Nathan absorbed and twisted into a personal religion that told him he was not bound by the rules that governed lesser minds. Richard Albert Loeb was born on June 11, 1905, also in Chicago, also into extraordinary wealth, his father being a senior vice president at Sears Roebuck and Company, and Richard, unlike Nathan, possessed a social magnetism and a personal charm that made him enormously popular wherever he went, the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan at just 17 years of age, and yet beneath that polished and charismatic exterior Richard had nurtured since childhood a deep fascination with crime, with detective novels, with the mechanics of lawbreaking, and with the romantic idea that a truly brilliant criminal could devise a scheme so perfect that no authority could ever unravel it. And when these two young men deepened their friendship at the University of Chicago, when Nathan's warped Nietzschean philosophy merged with Richard's childhood fantasy of being the greatest criminal mastermind who ever lived, the result was a partnership that would spend the better part of a year planning what they referred to between themselves as the perfect crime, not as a figure of speech but as a literal and deliberate objective, a crime so flawlessly conceived and executed that it would never be solved. And the planning phase itself was extensive and methodical in ways that investigators would later describe as deeply revealing of how completely detached both young men had become from any ordinary sense of human empathy, because they did not begin by choosing a victim but by choosing a concept, designing the framework of a kidnapping for ransom with a clean and final conclusion, renting an automobile under a false name, drafting a ransom note on a typewriter using a voice that was deliberately impersonal and untraceable, scouting locations along the drainage areas near Wolf Lake in Hammond, Indiana, where evidence could be permanently concealed, and approaching the entire exercise not as something morally weighted but as an abstract intellectual problem, to be optimized and solved. And what is perhaps most striking and most revealing is that in all the months of planning, in all the subsequent confessions and psychological evaluations, there exists no account of either young man expressing doubt, hesitation, or moral discomfort about what they were intending to do to another human being, because to them the victim was not yet a person but a variable in an equation, and the variable they ultimately selected on the afternoon of May 21, 1924 was a 14-year-old boy named Robert Franks, known to everyone who loved him as Bobby, a student at the Harvard School for Boys who lived just across the street from the Loeb family home in the Kenwood neighborhood, a boy who played tennis, who was well liked by his teachers and his classmates, who was the son of Jacob Franks, a successful watch manufacturer, and who had the profound misfortune of walking past at precisely the moment Leopold and Loeb were circling the neighborhood in their rented automobile looking for someone who fit their requirements, and Loeb, who knew Bobby through their social proximity, persuaded the boy to enter the vehicle on the casual pretext of wanting to discuss a tennis racket, And once Bobby was inside the car, the sequence of events moved with a swiftness and a finality that the boy had no opportunity to comprehend or resist, because he was struck with a chisel and gagged almost immediately, and he lost consciousness within minutes and never regained it. And by the time Leopold and Loeb arrived at the drainage culvert near Wolf Lake that evening, Bobby Franks was gone from the world. A 14-year-old boy with his entire life stretching ahead of him, eliminated in the space of an afternoon to satisfy the intellectual vanity of two young men who had convinced themselves that his life was simply less valuable than their desire for the thrill of getting away with something. And the body was placed in the culvert and concealed as planned. And the two young men then returned to Leopold's home, where they ate dinner, cleaned and disposed of any incriminating clothing, and finalized the ransom note they had already drafted. A note demanding $10,000 addressed to Jacob Franks for the safe return of a son who was already beyond anyone's reach. And Leopold placed the follow-up telephone call to Jacob Franks the following morning, identifying himself as George Johnson and instructing the father to prepare the ransom funds. But the plan, for all its months of careful preparation, was already disintegrating, because Bobby's body had been discovered that same morning by a laborer taking a shortcut along the railroad tracks near the culvert. The body had been identified, the kidnapping was already a homicide, and the evidence that Leopold and Loeb had in all their supposed intellectual superiority failed to account for was already pointing investigators in their direction. And that evidence was a pair of eyeglasses found near the concealment site, a distinctive design with an unusual hinge mechanism that had been sold by precisely one optician in Chicago to precisely 3 customers, one of whom was Nathan Leopold. And when police traced the glasses back to Leopold and brought him in for questioning, he provided what he believed was an airtight alibi, claiming he had spent the day driving around with Richard Loeb. But the alibi collapsed when the Leopold family's chauffeur informed investigators that Nathan's personal vehicle had been in the garage undergoing repairs for the entire duration of that day, meaning the alibi was impossible. And under sustained interrogation, both young men cracked and confessed, each attempting to place the direct responsibility on the other, though the core facts of what had happened to Bobby Franks were beyond dispute. And the case that followed became what journalists of the era unanimously called the crime of the century, not merely because of the wealth and privilege of the defendants, but because of the philosophical dimension of what they had done. Because here were 2 brilliant young men from the finest families in one of America's greatest cities who had taken a human life not for money, not out of rage, not out of desperation, but out of a pure and almost clinical desire to prove that they could. And the trial that summer of 1924 gripped the entire nation, with the legendary defense attorney Clarence Darrow entering the case on behalf of the Leopold and Loeb families and immediately making a decision that surprised everyone by entering guilty pleas for both defendants, removing the question of guilt from the courtroom entirely and directing everything toward the sentencing hearing, where Darrow delivered what many legal historians consider the most extraordinary and consequential closing argument of his career, a summation that lasted 12 hours spread across 2.5 days, in which he argued passionately and with profound eloquence that Leopold and Loeb were not monsters born of evil but broken young men shaped by forces beyond their control, that their warped philosophy was itself a kind of illness, that executing them would not restore Bobby Franks to his family but would simply add more loss to a world that already had too much of it, and that the state of Illinois would demonstrate its own civilization and humanity by choosing rehabilitation over retribution. And on September 10, 1924, Judge John Caverly announced his decision, sentencing both Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb to life in prison for the murder of Bobby Franks and an additional 99 years each for the kidnapping charge, sparing them from the death penalty and delivering a verdict that would echo through American legal history for decades. And the aftermath of the case played out across the years in ways both tragic and strange, because Richard Loeb, the charming and magnetic one, the boy who had dreamed of being a criminal mastermind, was attacked and fatally wounded by a fellow inmate at Stateville Prison in Joliet, Illinois on January 28, 1936, dying at just 30 years of age in the same prison, where he had expected to spend the rest of his life. And Nathan Leopold, the brilliant ornithologist who had believed himself a Nietzschean Superman above ordinary morality, spent 33 years behind bars before being granted parole in 1958, after which he relocated to Puerto Rico, where he taught mathematics, worked as an X-ray technician, published a book on ornithology, married a widowed American social worker named Trudy Feldman, and lived quietly until his death from a diabetes-related heart attack on August 29, 1971, and Bobby Franks, who had simply been walking home from school on a warm May afternoon in Chicago, never got any of those years, and his family, who received not the living boy they were promised in a ransom note but the permanent and irreversible news that their son was already gone, carried that loss for the rest of their lives, and the case of Leopold and Loeb left behind it not just grief and legal history but a question that American society has never fully answered, which is what do you do with a mind capable of extraordinary things that has been turned, through arrogance and isolation and a philosophy stripped of its humanity, towards something irredeemably destructive, and that question, as much as any verdict or sentence, is the true legacy of the boys who wanted to commit the perfect crime and discovered that no crime, no matter how carefully planned, is ever truly perfect. Number 2. Brenda Ann Spencer. The girl who did not like Mondays. There are moments in American history that arrive without warning and leave permanent marks on the national conscience. Moments that force a society to look honestly at things it would prefer not to examine, and the morning of January 29, 1979, in the San Carlos neighborhood of San Diego, California, was one of those moments, because on that morning a 16-year-old girl named Brenda Ann Spencer picked up a rifle, positioned herself at a window of her family home, and opened fire across the street at the children and staff of Grover Cleveland Elementary School, becoming in the process the first high-profile school shooter in the modern history of the United States and setting in motion a pattern of tragedy that would define American public life for generations to come. And to understand what happened that Monday morning, one must go back to the circumstances that produced Brenda Spencer, because she did not emerge from nothing. She did not simply wake up one morning having been fine the day before. She came from a childhood that was defined by poverty, neglect, instability, and a domestic environment so profoundly inadequate that multiple educational and psychological professionals had attempted in the years before the shooting to intervene on her behalf and had been turned away at every point. Brenda was born in 1962 and grew up in a small house in San Carlos with her father Wallace Spencer, a gun enthusiast and heavy drinker who had separated from Brenda's mother, leaving Brenda and Wallace sharing a single mattress on the floor of a home that neighbors described as disordered and deeply depressing. And the psychological picture that emerged from those who knew Brenda as a child and teenager was of a profoundly isolated young person who struggled to connect with her peers, who was frequently absent from school, who dabbled in petty theft and drug use, who excelled in art and photography when she engaged with the educational system at all, and who had, in the year before the shooting, been flagged by school authorities as exhibiting serious and concerning psychological disturbances, a recommendation having been made that she receive psychiatric evaluation and possibly residential treatment, a recommendation that her father rejected and refused to act upon. And then on Christmas of 1978, just weeks before the shooting, Wallace Spencer gave his 16-year-old daughter a gift that would prove catastrophic, because Brenda had reportedly asked for a radio, and what she received instead was a Ruger semi-automatic rifle and a supply of ammunition, a gift that placed a deadly tool in the hands of a deeply troubled young person who had already been assessed as a danger to herself and potentially to others, and a week before the shooting multiple classmates would later recall, Brenda had made statements to people around her indicating that she intended to do something significant, something that would get her on television, statements that were not reported and not acted upon. And so on the morning of January 29, 1979, with the school day beginning across the street and children gathering at the front gate of Grover Cleveland Elementary School waiting for the principal to open the campus for the day, Brenda Spencer positioned herself at a window of her home with the rifle she had received as a Christmas gift and opened fire, and the scene that unfolded in the next minutes was one of chaos and terror as children and staff scrambled for safety in every direction. And among those who ran toward the danger rather than away from it was the school's principal, 53-year-old Burton Ragg, who rushed outside in an attempt to shield children and direct them to safety, and it was while doing so that he was struck by gunfire and fell. And the school's custodian, 56-year-old Mike Sucher, who also rushed outside in an attempt to assist the fallen principal and the frightened children, was also struck and fell, and both men died from their injuries, making them the two fatalities of that morning's attack, while 8 children ranging in age from approximately 8 to 12 years old were also struck and wounded, and a 28-year-old police officer named Robert Robb, who was among the first responders to arrive on scene, was also wounded in the neck as he attempted to approach the source of the gunfire, and the attack continued for some time, with Brenda maintaining her position at the window and continuing to fire, and the police establishing a perimeter around the Spencer home and attempting to negotiate a resolution. And during the standoff, a local newspaper reporter, having somehow obtained the telephone number of the Spencer residence, placed a direct call to the house and reached Brenda, who answered, and, in the course of that conversation, when the reporter asked her why she had done what she had done, Brenda Spencer delivered what would become one of the most chilling and most quoted statements in the history of American crime, saying simply, "I don't like Mondays, this livens up the day," a statement so casual and so devoid of any apparent remorse or comprehension of what she had just done that it stopped the reporter cold and would go on to be repeated in newspapers, in courtrooms, in congressional testimony, and in a song by the Irish rock band the Boomtown Rats that reached #1 in the United Kingdom and introduced the case to an international audience. And the standoff at the Spencer home lasted for more than 6 hours before Brenda finally agreed to surrender and walked out of the house to be taken into custody. And she was 16 years old, and she would spend decades in prison attempting to explain what had happened and why, offering accounts that shifted over the years from bravado to expressions of regret, at one point claiming that she had been under the influence of alcohol and drugs she had consumed from her father's supply on the morning of the shooting, claiming that her memories of the event itself were fragmented and unclear, and the legal proceedings that followed moved through the California court system with Brenda being charged as an adult despite her age given the severity of what she had done. And she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of assault with a deadly weapon, and on April 4, 1980, one day after her 18th birthday, she was sentenced by a California judge to concurrent terms of 25 years to life in state prison, a sentence that made her eligible for parole consideration beginning in 1993, and what followed across the subsequent decades was a series of parole hearings that became in themselves a significant chapter of the case, because Brenda Spencer appeared before the California Board of Parole Hearings in 1993 and was denied, appeared again in 2001 and was denied, appeared in 2005 and was denied, appeared in 2009 and was denied, and appeared again in 2022 and was denied once more, with the board at each hearing citing the nature of the original offense, questions about Brenda's rehabilitation and insight, and the ongoing opposition of survivors, victims' families, and the San Diego County District Attorney's Office, which has consistently and actively argued against her release, and in February of 2025 Brenda Spencer appeared before the parole board for the 7th time and was denied again, with her next eligible hearing now scheduled for 2028. And as of the time of the script she remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, where she has been held for more than 4 decades, and the legacy of what she did on that January morning in 1979 extends far beyond her own sentence, because Brenda Spencer is widely regarded by criminologists and historians as the first modern high-profile school shooter in American history, the originator of a pattern that would be replicated in increasingly devastating ways across the decades that followed, and the San Diego County District Attorney has publicly stated that her actions had a profound influence on the trajectory of school violence in America, and Cam Miller, one of the children who was struck during the shooting and who has testified against Brenda's release at multiple parole hearings, has carried the physical and psychological weight of that January morning for his entire adult life, and Burton Ragg, who died running toward frightened children rather than away from them, and Mike Sucher, who died doing exactly the same thing, left behind families who have had to relive the events of that morning at every parole hearing and every anniversary, and the community of San Carlos, which, on the morning of January 29, 1979, was the kind of quiet, ordinary, suburban neighborhood where nothing like this was supposed to happen, was changed permanently and irrevocably by a 16-year-old girl sitting at a window with a rifle she had received as a Christmas gift. And the question that haunts the case, that has never been answered to anyone's full satisfaction, is how many intervention points existed in the years and months and weeks before that morning, how many professionals and educators and neighbors saw something concerning and tried to act, and how different things might have been if even one of those interventions had been received rather than rejected. Number 3. Craig Chandler Price, the Warwick Slasher. The state of Rhode Island is among the smallest in the American Union, a compact and historic place where communities are close-knit and neighbors tend to know one another across years and sometimes generations. And it was precisely that intimacy, that sense of safe familiarity between people who share the same streets and the same schools and the same everyday rhythms of life, that made the crimes of Craig Chandler Price so particularly devastating to the community of Warwick, Rhode Island, because Craig Price did not target strangers, did not travel to find his victims, did not operate in the shadows of some distant and anonymous urban landscape. He simply walked out of his own house and went a few doors down the street, and the people he chose were his neighbors, people whose names he knew, people whose houses he had walked past every day of his life, and he did what he did to them before he was old enough to drive a car, and the legal system that was supposed to respond to what he had done discovered to its horror that it had almost no tools available to hold him accountable in any meaningful way. And the story of Craig Price is therefore not only a story about a deeply disturbed young person committing acts of profound harm against innocent people, but also a story about the catastrophic inadequacy of a legal framework that had never been designed to deal with someone like him. Craig Chandler Price was born on October 11, 1973, and grew up in the Buttonwoods neighborhood of Warwick, Rhode Island, a working-class residential area of modest ranch-style homes and tree-lined streets. And as a child and early teenager, Craig had accumulated a juvenile record for petty offenses including breaking and entering, robbery, and assault, offenses that were concerning but not entirely unusual for a troubled adolescent from a difficult background, and neighbors who knew him described him in ways that were contradictory and unsettling in retrospect, some recalling him as a good-humored and sociable boy who was known around the neighborhood, others noting a quality of unpredictability and an edge of something harder and darker beneath the surface. And it was on the night of July 27, 1987, when Craig Price was just 13 years old, that the full dimensions of what lay beneath that surface first revealed themselves. Because on that night Craig left his home and entered the residence of his neighbor Rebecca Spencer, a 27-year-old woman who lived just 2 houses away, and what happened inside that house left Rebecca Spencer dead, the victim of a prolonged and ferocious assault that investigators would describe as among the most extreme they had encountered in the course of their careers. And when police investigated Rebecca Spencer's death in the days that followed, they had no suspect, no witnesses, and no physical evidence that conclusively pointed them in any specific direction, and so the case went unsolved, filed away as a deeply troubling open investigation in the records of the Warwick Police Department, while Craig Price continued to attend school and move through his neighborhood and interact with the community around him as though nothing had happened. And 2 years passed. 2 years during which Craig Price lived among the people of Buttonwoods and walked past the houses of his neighbors every day and gave no outward indication to those around him of what he was carrying inside. And then on September 1, 1989, when Craig was 15 years old and just beginning his freshman year of high school, he left his home again and entered the residence of another neighbor, 39-year-old Joan Heaton, who lived with her 2 young daughters, 10-year-old Jennifer and 8-year-old Melissa. And what occurred in that house over the course of that night was of a nature so severe and so disturbing that when investigators arrived at the scene in the early hours of September 2nd, they were confronted with something that multiple veteran detectives would later say was unlike anything they had seen before, and all 3 members of the Heaton family, Joan, Jennifer, and Melissa, were gone, none of them having survived what Craig Price had done. And the investigation that followed moved quickly because the nature of the evidence at the scene suggested that the perpetrator was someone physically present in the immediate neighborhood, someone who had entered the home without forced entry, suggesting familiarity. And when detectives began canvassing the area and interviewing residents, they noticed something about Craig Price. A cut on his hand that he attempted to explain away as an unrelated injury, and when a lie detector examination was administered and Price failed it, investigators obtained a search warrant for the Price residence, where they found physical evidence connecting Craig directly to the Heaton home, and Craig Price, 15 years old, was brought in for formal questioning. And what happened next stunned the detectives in the room, because Craig Price did not crumble under interrogation the way most 15-year-olds would, did not become frightened or tearful or confused, but instead began to speak with a calm and almost conversational ease about what he had done, confessing not only to the Heaton deaths but also to the murder of Rebecca Spencer 2 years earlier, the case that had sat unsolved in the department's files, and he did so without apparent remorse, without visible distress, and at certain points, according to the detectives present, with a quality of casual detachment that was deeply unsettling to everyone in the room. And law enforcement and the prosecutors who took the case immediately recognized that they had something extraordinarily dangerous on their hands, a 15-year-old boy who had committed 4 homicides across 2 years, who had shown no remorse and no hesitation, and who showed every psychological indication of being capable of further harm if released. But then the terrible reality of Rhode Island law at the time became clear to everyone involved, because the statutes governing juvenile offenders in Rhode Island in 1989 contained a provision that seemed almost impossible to believe given the circumstances, which was that no matter what offense a juvenile had committed, no matter how severe or how numerous, that juvenile could not be held in custody past his 21st birthday, meaning that Craig Price, who had taken 4 lives before his 16th birthday, was legally entitled to walk free the moment he turned 21, and Price was tried as a juvenile, sentenced to the maximum available under the law, and placed in the Youth Correctional Center, the maximum security wing of the Rhode Island Training School for Juveniles, and the reaction from the Warwick community, from the families of the victims, and from Rhode Island residents more broadly was one of profound outrage and disbelief, and a citizens group called Citizens Opposed to the Release of Craig Price was formed specifically to lobby against his eventual release, and the case directly led to changes in Rhode Island state law that allowed juveniles to be tried as adults for serious criminal offenses, though those changes could not be applied retroactively to Price himself. And as the years passed and his 21st birthday approached, public anxiety in Rhode Island grew, but Craig Price's own behavior during his incarceration ensured that he never actually walked free at 21, because he accumulated additional charges while in juvenile detention and then in adult facilities, including charges of extortion, assault on a corrections officer, and a series of other offenses that kept extending his legal jeopardy, and in 2004 he was transferred from Rhode Island to Florida due to his notoriety and the management challenges he presented. And in Florida his pattern of institutional misconduct continued, and in April 2017 he was charged with the attempted murder of a fellow inmate at the Sewanee Correctional Institution, having attacked the inmate with a homemade 5-inch knife in what surveillance footage showed was a premeditated assault, and in January 2019 Craig Price pleaded guilty to that charge and was sentenced to an additional 25 years in prison. Meaning that the boy who had bragged upon his arrest that he would make history when the law let him go at 21 has never actually been free, and as of the writing of the script Craig Chandler Price, known in criminal justice circles as the Warwick Slasher and as the youngest serial killer in United States history, remains incarcerated at the Union Correctional Facility in Florida, and the families of Rebecca Spencer and of Joan, Jennifer, and Melissa Heaton have had to carry the weight of what he did to them across decades, the parents and siblings and extended family of 4 people who were alive and going about the ordinary business of their lives and then were simply gone, taken by a boy from down the street who felt nothing about what he had done. And the case of Craig Price remains one of the most studied in American criminal justice, not only because of what he did but because of what it revealed about the gaps and limitations of a legal system that had never imagined it would need to respond to someone like him. Number 4. Eric Smith, the boy in the Bugs Bunny sweatshirt. There is a photograph that became famous almost immediately after it was taken, a photograph that appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the United States and lodged itself in the national consciousness with a power that no one who saw it at the time has ever fully been able to shake. And the photograph shows a 13-year-old boy sitting in a courtroom in Steuben County, New York, wearing a Bugs Bunny sweatshirt, his red hair uncombed, his thick glasses slightly askew on his face, his expression completely unreadable, neither frightened nor defiant nor remorseful but simply blank, as though he were sitting in a school cafeteria rather than a murder trial, and the boy in that photograph was Eric M. Smith, and the reason he was sitting in that courtroom on that particular day in 1994, the reason that photograph exists at all, is that on the morning of August 2, 1993, Eric Smith had done something to a 4-year-old boy named Derek Joseph Roby that the town of Savona, New York, and the country at large were still struggling to comprehend a year later. And the story of Eric Smith and Derek Roby is in many ways the story of how 2 childhoods, one already troubled and one barely begun, intersected on a summer morning in a small town and produced a tragedy that reverberated far beyond the borders of Steuben County for decades. Eric M. Smith was born on January 22, 1980, and grew up in Savona, a small village in Steuben County in western New York, a community the size of which meant that everyone knew everyone else and privacy was more concept than reality. And from early in his childhood Eric had been marked by difficulties that set him apart from his peers because he had speech problems significant enough to require professional intervention, a history of emotional outbursts and violent temper episodes dating back to his earliest years, and he was, from the time he began school, a consistent and relentless target of bullying from other children who seized on his physical appearance. His small stature, his red hair and freckles, his thick glasses, as material for sustained cruelty, and the cumulative weight of that bullying across the years of his childhood was something that investigators, psychologists, and the courts would later spend enormous effort trying to understand and evaluate, trying to determine whether and to what degree the years of being a target had contributed to what Eric did on August 2, 1993, though the question of causation in a case like this is never clean and never simple, and the answer has never satisfied everyone. Derek Joseph Roby was born on October 2, 1988, which made him 4 years and 10 months old on the morning that would be his last. And he lived with his parents Dale and Doreen Roby and his infant brother Dalton just down the street from Savona's recreational park, where a summer recreation program for children was held each morning, and Derek attended that program regularly, always accompanied by his mother on the short walk from their front door to the park. A walk of only 1 block. Along the same side of the street, a walk so brief and so familiar that when the morning of August 2nd arrived and Doreen had her hands full with a fussy Dalton, Derek asked if he could make the walk alone, and Doreen, knowing how short and how safe the route was, agreed, and she gave her son a kiss, and Derek said, "I love you, Mom," and went hopping off down the sidewalk, and that was the last moment Doreen Roby ever saw her son alive. Eric Smith was also out that morning, riding his bicycle, and he spotted Derek walking alone and approached him, and what happened next, according to Eric's own confessions and admissions over the years that followed, was that Eric lured the younger boy off the sidewalk with some form of inducement, telling him about a shortcut or something interesting in the wooded area beside the path, and once the two of them were in that small patch of woods, away from the sidewalk and out of sight of anyone passing by, Eric Smith, who was 13 years old and had spent years absorbing the role of victim in every social interaction he entered, turned that dynamic inside out in the most devastating way imaginable, because he attacked Derek Roby, a child less than half his age and a fraction of his size, and he harmed him so severely that when investigators arrived at the scene hours later, after Doreen had raced to the park and found that Derek had never arrived and the search had begun, what they found in that patch of woods was evidence of something that lead investigator Charles Wood would later describe as almost impossible to process, not because of what had been done but because of what it implied about the person who had done it, about the state of mind required to do such a thing to a child so small and so defenseless. And the body of Derek Roby was found in that wooded area just a few hundred yards from his own front door and just a few yards from the park, where he had been headed, and the immediate assumption of investigators and of the broader community was that the perpetrator had to have been an adult, had to have been someone from outside the area, because the alternative, that a child from within this small and tight-knit community had done this, was something that the mind resisted almost as a reflex. And so for a period of days, the investigation proceeded on the assumption of an adult perpetrator from outside Savona, and concerned parents kept their children indoors while police searched for someone who matched that profile, and Eric Smith, 13 years old, joined the community search parties that were looking for evidence related to the case, and he was interviewed by police as part of their routine canvass of local children and residents and said nothing. And it was only as the investigation deepened and the physical evidence from the scene was analyzed and patterns began to emerge that suspicion began to focus on Eric Smith, and when detectives brought him in for more intensive questioning he eventually confessed, and the community of Savona experienced a second wave of shock that was in some ways more profound than the first, because this was not an outsider, this was a child they knew, a boy who attended their schools and rode his bicycle on their streets and had stood alongside them searching for evidence of his own crime. And the legal proceedings that followed were extraordinary because in New York State at the time, murder was one of the very few charges for which a 13-year-old could be tried as an adult court, and Eric Smith was charged with second-degree murder and tried as an adult, with the trial moving to Steuben County amid intense national media coverage, and the defense presented an argument centered on a rage disorder and the years of bullying Eric had endured, arguing that he was not fully criminally responsible for his actions. And the prosecution argued that Eric had understood precisely what he was doing and that full criminal responsibility was appropriate regardless of his age, and the jury deliberated and found Eric Smith guilty of second-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to the maximum term available for juvenile murderers at that time under New York law, which was 9 years to life in prison, and the sentence meant that Eric would become eligible for parole in 2002, when he turned 22, and the parole process that followed across the next 2 decades became its own extraordinary chapter of the case, because Dale and Doreen Roby, who had lost their 4-year-old son to Eric Smith on a summer morning in 1993, appeared at every single parole hearing to oppose his release year after year, hearing after hearing, carrying the weight of August 2nd, 1993 into every one of those rooms and speaking about their son and about the void his absence had left in their lives and in the life of his brother Dalton, who had been just an infant. On the morning Derek left the house for the last time, and the parole board denied Eric Smith's release in 2002 and denied it again in 2004 and denied it in every subsequent hearing through 2020, 10 denials across nearly 2 decades, with the board citing concerns about public safety and the nature of the original offense and the opposition of the victim's family, and Eric Smith, for his part, spent those years in the New York State prison system where he completed educational programs, spoke at parole hearings with what he described as genuine remorse, and in a statement made in 2004 said that he thought every day about what Derek would never experience. His 16th birthday, graduations, his first home, marriage, children, and said that if he could go back and trade places with Derek, he would do so without hesitation. And the prosecutor who had tried his case, John Tunney, was unconvinced, stating publicly that he had no doubt Eric Smith would have continued harming people if he had not been caught in 1993, and that releasing him represented a genuine risk to public safety. And then in October 2021, at his 11th parole hearing, after 27 years of incarceration, the parole board granted Eric Smith's release, and he was released from the Woodbourne Correctional Facility on February 1, 2022, at the age of 42, and the community of Savona held a candlelight vigil at Derek Roby's memorial near the village's Little League fields, and Dale and Doreen Roby, who had spent 27 years appearing before parole boards to keep the man who had taken their son behind bars, expressed a pain and a resignation that words could only partially convey. And Doreen said she did not let Eric take space in her head, that she did not focus on where he was or what he was doing, and Dale said that his concern was not so much for himself and Doreen as it was for everyone else. And Eric Smith was discharged from parole supervision on April 16, 2025, and Derek Roby, who gave his mother a kiss on a summer morning and went hopping off down the sidewalk to a park he never reached, remains in the memory of everyone who knew him and in the photographs and memorials that the town of Savona has maintained in his honor for more than 30 years. Number 5. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, Columbine. There are events in American history that divide time into before and after, events so catastrophic and so consequential that they alter permanently the way a society thinks, behaves, and organizes itself, and the events of April 20, 1999, at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, are unambiguously among those events, because what Eric David Harris and Dylan Bennett Klebold did on that Tuesday morning did not simply take lives. It transformed American education, it reshaped national conversations about mental health and adolescent psychology and access to weapons. It generated a cultural and political debate that continues to this day more than 2 decades later, and it gave the world a word, Columbine, that has since become shorthand for the specific and devastating phenomenon of mass violence at a school carried out by students against their own community. And to understand what happened at Columbine, one must resist the simplified narratives that emerged in the immediate aftermath and have persisted in the popular imagination, the narrative of 2 rejected outcasts taking revenge on the popular kids who bullied them, because that narrative, however emotionally satisfying it may be as an explanation, is not supported by the evidence, and what the evidence actually shows is something considerably more complex, more disturbing, and in some ways more difficult to address precisely because it does not fit neatly into a simple story of cause and effect. Eric David Harris was born on April 9, 1981, in Wichita, Kansas, the son of a United States Air Force officer whose career required the family to relocate frequently across Eric's childhood, and Eric attended schools in several different states before the Harris family settled in Littleton, Colorado in 1993, and he enrolled at Columbine High School where he eventually met Dylan Klebold and the two became close friends. And Eric was by academic accounts an intelligent student with a high grade point average and a significant interest in computer programming and video game design, having created his own game levels as a hobby, and he was by various accounts also charming in social settings, capable of presenting himself as friendly and agreeable to teachers and adults while harboring in his private journals and in the privacy of his own mind a worldview that the FBI's behavioral analysts, who studied the case extensively after the fact, concluded was consistent with clinical psychopathy, a profound and fundamental absence of empathy combined with an equally profound contempt for other human beings and a grandiosity that convinced Eric Harris that he was fundamentally superior to the people around him and that those people deserved whatever fate he decided to impose on them. Dylan Bennett Klebold was born on September 11, 1981, in Lakewood, Colorado, and unlike Eric was a native of the area, the son of pacifist parents who attended a Lutheran church and raised their children in a household that friends and family later described as warm, supportive, and attentive, which made the question of how Dylan ended up where he ended up one of the most agonizing that his mother Sue Klebold would spend the rest of her life attempting to answer, and Dylan's private journals, which were examined by investigators after the events of April 20th, reveal a young man consumed by depression, by a sense of profound unworthiness, by an obsessive and years-long preoccupation with the idea of his own death, and by a romantic despair so total and so internalized that he had been carrying it essentially alone for years without anyone around him, including his parents, recognizing its depth or its danger, and what the FBI's lead behavioral analyst Duane Fuselier concluded after years of studying both young men was that Eric went to Columbine that morning to cause harm and did not particularly care about dying in the process, while Dylan went to Columbine that morning wanting to die and did not particularly care about the harm to others that his dying would involve. And the combination of those two psychological states, Eric's cold and calculated destructive intent and Dylan's suicidal despair, created a partnership that was more dangerous than either young man would have been alone. The planning that preceded April 20, 1999 began approximately a year before the attack and was documented in the journals and videos that Harris and Klebold kept throughout the period. And what those documents reveal is a plan that was, in its original conception, far more catastrophic in scale than what ultimately occurred, because Harris and Klebold did not initially conceive of a shooting as their primary method of attack but rather planned a bombing, intending to place large propane tank bombs in the school cafeteria timed to detonate during the busiest period of the lunch hour, which investigators calculated could potentially have killed hundreds of students, and they planned to be positioned outside with firearms to intercept students fleeing the explosions, and the entire scheme was in its ambition and its calculated approach to maximizing harm, something that went far beyond the typical framework of what most people imagined when they thought about school violence. And Harris wrote in his journal about wanting to surpass the destruction of the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, and both young men made videos in the weeks before the attack that were found afterward, videos in which they spoke directly to the camera about what they were planning and why, saying goodbye to their families, expressing regret not about what they were about to do but about not having been able to do more. And on the morning of April 20, 1999, they arrived at Columbine High School in separate vehicles carrying the bombs and the firearms and the additional explosive devices they had constructed, and they placed the propane bombs in the cafeteria in duffel bags and went outside to wait for the detonation, and the bombs did not go off, a technical failure that altered the trajectory of the day without preventing the tragedy that followed. And beginning at approximately 11:19 in the morning, Harris and Klebold initiated the attack that would last approximately 49 minutes, and would claim the lives of 12 students and one teacher before the two perpetrators took their own lives in the school library. And the names of those who were lost that day: Rachel Scott, Daniel Rohrbaugh, William Dave Sanders, Kyle Velasquez, Stephen Kernow, Cassie Bernal, Isaiah Shoels, Matthew Kechter, Lauren Townsend, John Tomlin, Kelly Fleming, Daniel Mauser, Corey DePuter, and years later in 2025 and Marie Hochhalter, whose death from complications of her injuries was ruled a homicide, bringing the final toll to 14, are names that belong to the permanent record of American history. And in the immediate aftermath of Columbine, the country convulsed with grief and with debate, with arguments about access to weapons, about the influence of violent entertainment and music, about the role of bullying in schools, about the adequacy of mental health resources for adolescents, about the responsibility of parents and educators and communities to identify and respond to signs of serious psychological distress in young people, and many of those debates have continued without resolution ever since, and the case generated an enormous body of research and policy response, with schools across America implementing security measures, active shooter drills, zero-tolerance policies, threat assessment protocols, and a whole architecture of precautionary systems that had not existed before April 20, 1999, and the word Columbine entered the language as a reference point. That required no further explanation, and by some counts the attack has inspired more than 70 documented copycat attempts or attacks in the years since, a phenomenon that researchers have named the Columbine effect, a grim testament to the power of the event to capture the imagination of deeply troubled individuals in subsequent generations. And Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were 17 and 18 years old on April 20, 1999, and they have been the subject of more research, more analysis, more documentation, and more debate than almost any other individuals in the history of American crime, and the families of the 14 people who were lost, and the families of the 21 who were wounded, and the community of Littleton, Colorado, and the teachers and staff of Columbine High School, and the first responders who arrived that morning and worked for hours in a building that had been turned into something unimaginable, have all carried the weight of that day across the more than 2 decades since, and Columbine High School itself reopened in the fall of 1999 and continues to operate as a school, a fact that is itself a kind of statement about the determination of a community to refuse to be defined permanently by the worst thing that ever happened within its borders. Number 6. Alyssa Bustamante, The Diary and the Dark Side. The town of St. Martin's, Missouri is the kind of small, quiet community where neighbors know each other's names and children grow up playing in the same yards and walking to the same schools. And in that community in the autumn of 2009 there lived a 15-year-old girl named Alyssa Bustamante and a 9-year-old girl named Elizabeth K. Olton. And they lived just 4 houses apart from each other on the same street. And on the evening of October 21, 2009, Elizabeth Olton was making her way home after visiting a friend nearby, a short and familiar journey through a neighborhood she had walked hundreds of times, and she never arrived home, and what happened to her in the woods near her neighborhood would expose to the world one of the most disturbing cases of adolescent criminal psychology that American law enforcement and the judicial system had ever been asked to confront, not only because of the act itself but because of what investigators found afterward in the words Alyssa Bustamante had written in her own hand, in a diary discovered in her bedroom, in entries that revealed a state of mind that shocked everyone who read them. Alyssa Bustamante had not had an easy childhood by any measure, having been raised by her grandparents Gary and Karen Brooke since 2002 after her mother Michelle's struggles with addiction made it impossible for her to provide a stable home, and her father Caesar was incarcerated on assault charges. And from approximately 2007 onward Alyssa had been showing signs of serious psychological distress, having been hospitalized following a suicide attempt and having been placed on medication for depression, and those who knew her during this period described a teenager who was struggling in ways that were visible but whose depths were not fully understood by the adults around her. And her social media presence during this time included images and statements that in retrospect carry an ominous quality, with Alyssa listing among her interests in an online profile, in what appeared to be a darkly ironic statement, the phrase cutting and killing people, a statement that was visible to anyone who looked at her profile but that apparently did not trigger any formal intervention or escalation of her psychiatric care. And in the weeks before October 21, 2009, Alyssa had been doing something in the woods behind her neighborhood that she had told no one about. She had been digging, and when investigators later examined those woods they found what she had been preparing, a site that had clearly been made ready in advance of something she was planning. And on the evening of October 21, Alyssa used her younger sister Emma as an intermediary, asking Emma to go and invite Elizabeth Olton to come out and spend time with them, and Elizabeth, who was 9 years old and had no reason to be afraid, agreed and followed Emma toward the woods. And once Elizabeth arrived at the spot where Alyssa was waiting, Alyssa sent Emma away, and what happened next in those woods was something that Alyssa herself recorded in her diary in an entry dated October 21, 2009, an entry that investigators initially struggled to read because she had attempted to scratch it out, but that forensic document examiners were able to recover, and the entry, written in the handwriting of a 15-year-old girl, described what she had done to Elizabeth Olton with a casualness and a quality of excitement that stunned every investigator and prosecutor who read it, describing the experience as amazing and noting that once she got past the initial hesitation she found it enjoyable. And she ended the entry by noting that she had to go to church, a detail that encapsulated in a single phrase the profound disconnect between the exterior life Alyssa was presenting to the world and the interior life she was actually living. And Elizabeth Olton did not come home for dinner that evening as she had promised her mother she would, and Patricia Price, Elizabeth's mother, reported her daughter missing, and what followed was a 2-day search involving hundreds of law enforcement officers and volunteers from the community who combed the woods and fields and roads around St. Martin's in the rain and cold of an October night and the following day, and Alyssa Bustamante participated in that search, and then investigators, working from the physical evidence recovered at the scene and from the FBI's examination of a journal found in Alyssa's bedroom during a search of her home, developed Alyssa as a suspect and confronted her. And she led authorities to where Elizabeth Olton's body had been concealed in the shallow grave she had prepared in the woods behind the neighborhood, and Elizabeth, who had celebrated her 9th birthday in December, was found there, and the community of St. Martin's, which had spent 2 days searching desperately and hopefully, received the worst possible news, and the legal proceedings that followed placed Alyssa Bustamante, who had been 15 at the time of the crime, into an adult judicial framework, and she was originally charged with first-degree murder, a charge that carried a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. But in January 2012, shortly before her scheduled trial, Alyssa entered a guilty plea to the reduced charges of second-degree murder and armed criminal action, and on February 8, 2012, she appeared in Cole County Circuit Court in Jefferson City and addressed the family of Elizabeth Olton directly, saying that she knew words could never be enough and could never fix what she had broken, and that if she could give her life to bring Elizabeth back she would. And the judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole for the murder charge, and an additional 30 years for the armed criminal action charge to be served consecutively. And the sentencing structure under Missouri guidelines meant that Alyssa would need to serve a minimum of approximately 35 years before becoming eligible for parole, placing her earliest possible release date in 2044 when she would be 50 years old, and the case subsequently became entangled in broader questions of juvenile justice and sentencing reform, when the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling in a separate case that same year holding that automatic life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional, a ruling that Alyssa's new attorneys argued applied to her situation, though the original plea agreement and the subsequent court proceedings maintained the essential structure of her sentence. And in 2024 a parole hearing was held for Alyssa Bustamante under Missouri Senate Bill 26, legislation designed to allow juvenile offenders earlier parole consideration. But the hearing ended with parole being denied, and the efforts of Elizabeth Olten's family, who had fought actively and publicly against any early release, were successful in that instance, and subsequently Missouri Governor Mike Parson signed Senate Bill 754, which amended the earlier legislation to block parole under those provisions for defendants convicted of second-degree murder, effectively closing the avenue that had led to the 2024 hearing, and Alyssa Bustamante remains incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Center in Chillicothe, Missouri, and Elizabeth K. Olten, who was born on December 15, 1999, and who promised her mother she would be home for dinner, never came home, and Patricia Price has spent the years since her daughter's death fighting not only for justice in the courtroom but for legislative changes designed to ensure that what happened to Elizabeth cannot be used as the foundation of an argument for early release, and the diary entry that Alyssa Bustamante wrote on the night of October 21, 2009, has become one of the most cited documents in academic literature on adolescent criminal psychology, not because it provides answers but because of the questions it raises about what was happening inside the mind of a 15-year-old girl who was receiving psychiatric treatment and living in a community that had no idea what she was planning, and about what more might have been done and at what point and by whom. Number 7. Anissa Weier and Morgan Geyser, the Slender Man case. There is a particular quality of disorientation that comes from reading about the Slender Man case, a quality that arises from the collision of the very ordinary and the deeply extraordinary, because on one level the events of May 31, 2014 in Waukesha, Wisconsin involve 3 12-year-old girls at a sleepover in a suburb, which is one of the most ordinary and innocuous scenarios imaginable, 3 children the same age, friends from the same neighborhood, spending the night together the way millions of children do every weekend in communities across the country. And on another level those same events involve an attempted act of extreme harm motivated by the 2 girls' genuine belief that a fictional supernatural entity from internet horror fiction was real, and was watching them and would harm their families unless they proved their loyalty to him by harming their friend. And the collision of those 2 levels, the mundane and the genuinely disturbing, is what has made the case one of the most extensively analyzed and most widely discussed examples of the intersection between adolescent psychology, internet culture, and real-world harm in the modern era. Morgan E. Geyser was born on May 16, 2002, in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and Anissa E. Weier was born on November 10, 2001, also in Waukesha, and the 2 girls lived in the same apartment building and were close friends who shared an interest in online horror fiction, specifically a genre known as creepypasta, which consists of user-generated horror stories and characters that circulate on the internet, and chief among the figures that populated this genre in the early 2010s was the Slender Man, a tall, thin, faceless entity in a dark suit who appeared in the background of photographs and who was described in various online stories as stalking children and claiming those who became aware of him as his servants or proxies, and what had begun for Morgan and Anissa as an interest in internet horror fiction had, by sometime in the autumn of 2013, crossed into something considerably more concerning, because both girls had come to believe that the Slender Man was not fictional but real, that he was genuinely watching them and their families, and that they were required to demonstrate their loyalty to him in order to protect the people they loved from his attention, and that demonstration, in the logic of their shared belief system, required them to bring him a human sacrifice specifically to harm or eliminate their closest friend. Peyton Isabella Lutner, known to her family and friends as Bella, was born on the same year as Morgan and Anissa and was a childhood friend who had grown particularly close to Morgan, and the three girls had been spending time together in the weeks and months before May 2014, and Morgan and Anissa's plan to harm Bella had reportedly been discussed and considered on multiple occasions before May 31st, with earlier opportunities having been contemplated and then not acted upon. And on the night of May 30th, 2014, the three girls had a sleepover at Morgan's home that proceeded normally on the surface, with the three of them playing games and talking and doing the things that 12-year-old girls at sleepovers do, while Morgan and Anissa were aware of what they planned to do the following morning. And on the morning of May 31st, the three girls went to a park near the apartment complex called David's Park, and Morgan and Anissa told Bella they were going to play hide and seek in the wooded area of the park, and Anissa told Bella to lie down and cover herself in leaves and sticks as part of the game. And it was in that moment, with Bella on the ground in the woods, that the attack began, with Morgan producing a knife she had brought and both girls acting together in a way that left Bella with 19 separate injuries across her arms, legs, and torso, including wounds to two major organs. And after the attack, Morgan and Anissa told Bella to lie still while they went to get help. And then they left without getting help, and Bella, who was 12 years old and alone in the woods with 19 injuries, made a decision that her parents would later describe as the decision that saved her life, which was simply that she wanted to live, and she began to crawl, and she crawled out of the woods and toward the road, and a cyclist found her at the edge of the park and called emergency services, and the surgeon who operated on Bella later said that if any one of the deeper injuries had been a fraction of a centimeter different in its placement, she would not have survived. And Bella was in the hospital for a week and then returned home and returned to school in September 2014, though she has spoken in subsequent years about the lasting psychological impact of what happened and about the fact that she slept for years with broken scissors by her bed because she could not feel safe without them. Morgan and Anissa were found approximately 5 hours after the attack walking along Interstate 94 about 5 miles from the park, carrying a backpack that contained another knife and other items. And when police questioned them, they were remarkably candid about what they had done and why, explaining their belief in the Slender Man, their conviction that he was real, and their understanding that harming Bella was necessary to protect their families, and the clarity and consistency with which they articulated this belief system was itself deeply concerning to the investigators and the mental health professionals who subsequently evaluated them, because it was not a confused or incoherent account but a detailed and internally consistent worldview that both girls shared and had apparently reinforced in each other over the course of months. And both Anissa and Morgan were charged as adults with attempted first-degree intentional homicide, which in Wisconsin carries a maximum penalty of 60 years in prison, and the trials that followed in 2017 were bench trials focused primarily on the question of mental responsibility. And in Anissa's case, the jury found her not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, accepting the defense's argument that her belief in the Slender Man constituted a genuine delusional disorder that impaired her ability to distinguish right from wrong, and she was sentenced to 25 years of commitment to a secure psychiatric institution, with Judge Michael Boren noting the seriousness of the offense and the ongoing mental health concerns documented in her evaluations. And in Morgan's case, she pleaded guilty to attempted first-degree intentional homicide with an agreement that she would not be found criminally responsible due to her diagnosis of early-onset schizophrenia, which court-appointed psychiatrists confirmed, and she received the maximum sentence of 40 years of commitment to a state forensic psychiatric hospital. And the subsequent years saw both young women undergo intensive psychiatric treatment, and in July 2021 a judge approved Anissa Weier's conditional release, and she went to live with her father under strict supervision and ongoing monitoring. And in 2025 Morgan Geyser was approved for conditional release to a group home, with her supervision continuing under court oversight until 2058, and Peyton Lutner, who survived, has spoken publicly about her experience and about the long process of healing from what happened to her on May 31, 2014, and her mother Stacy has spoken about the ongoing nature of the trauma and about her daughter's courage in the years since. And the Slender Man case generated enormous public debate about the responsibility of online platforms for the content they host, about the ways in which disturbed adolescents can construct shared delusional belief systems through internet communities, about the adequacy of early intervention for childhood mental illness, and about the profound complexity of assigning legal and moral responsibility when the perpetrators themselves genuinely could not distinguish between a fictional internet monster and reality. Number 8. Joshua Phillips, The Secret Under the Bed. The disappearance of a child is among the most agonizing experiences a community can endure, Because in the days between the moment a child goes missing and the moment their fate becomes known, there exists a suspension of time in which hope and dread coexist in a state of unbearable tension. And the community of Jacksonville, Florida, experienced that suspension in November 1998 when 8-year-old Madeline Ray Clifton, known to everyone who loved her as Maddie, did not come home, and for 6 days thousands of volunteers, including police officers and firefighters and ordinary neighbors, walked the woods and the roadsides and the drainage areas of the surrounding neighborhood calling her name and hoping. And among those thousands of volunteers was a 14-year-old boy from across the street named Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips, who searched alongside Maddie's family and the rest of the community with every appearance of genuine concern, and who was, throughout those 6 days of searching, the only person on earth who knew exactly where Maddie was. Joshua Phillips was born on March 17, 1984, in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and had lived with his family in the Jacksonville neighborhood where the events of November 1998 unfolded. And those who knew him before the events of that month described him in ways that make the subsequent revelation of what he had done all the more disorienting, because his teacher called him a popular student who was fun and silly and did not stand out in any concerning way, and his neighbors described him as quiet and friendly, and Maddie Clifton's own family, including her parents and her older sister Jessie, confirmed that they had always felt comfortable with Joshua and had never had any reason to be concerned about their daughter's safety around him. And the two children were friends and playmates who had known each other across the years they had been neighbors. And the events of November 3, 1998 began, according to Joshua's own account, as an ordinary afternoon when Maddie, who lived across the road, came to the Phillips house and asked Joshua to come outside and play baseball. And Joshua agreed even though his parents were not home and he was not supposed to have friends over in their absence. And as the two children played baseball in the yard, something happened. Joshua said that he accidentally hit the ball into Maddie's eye, causing her to cry out and bleed, and the response to that accident, whatever its precise nature, was shaped by something Joshua later described as a consuming panic rooted in his terror of his father's response. Because Steve Phillips was by multiple accounts a man who held his son to extremely strict standards, and whose anger when those standards were violated was something Joshua lived in constant fear of, and in that panic Joshua made a decision that he would spend decades attempting to explain, and that no explanation has ever made fully comprehensible to the people who loved Maddie Clifton, and what the physical evidence at the scene demonstrated. And what the prosecution would argue forcefully at trial was that what happened to Maddie Clifton on the afternoon of November 3rd was not an accident and not simply a panicked response to an accidental injury, but something considerably more deliberate and considerably more sustained. And Maddie's body was concealed inside the frame of Joshua's waterbed mattress in his bedroom, hidden in a space so small and so seemingly inaccessible that investigators who searched the room on multiple occasions during the 6-day search did not find it, and Joshua continued to live in that bedroom for 6 days, to sleep in that bed, to interact with his parents and with the community searching for Maddie. And when Melissa Phillips entered her son's room on November 10th and noticed a dampness on the floor and traced it to the waterbed frame and found what was inside, she left the house immediately and contacted the police, and Joshua was arrested at his school later that day and confessed within hours, and the detective who had spoken with Joshua in that very bedroom during the search, who had sat with him in the room where Maddie was concealed while Joshua petted his dog and appeared completely calm, later said it was one of the most chilling professional experiences of his career, because Joshua had been entirely composed, entirely normal in his effect, showing no sign whatsoever of the secret that was in the same room with both of them. Joshua Phillips was tried as an adult, the trial having been moved from Duval County to Polk County due to the enormous publicity the case had generated in Jacksonville, and the defense presented an argument centered on the concept of panic and the psychological effect of Joshua's fear of his father's reaction. And the prosecution argued that the physical evidence and the timeline of events were inconsistent with an accidental origin, and that Joshua had understood and intended what he was doing. And the jury convicted Joshua Phillips of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that was subsequently revisited in 2017 following the United States Supreme Court's ruling in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional. And at a resentencing hearing in 2017, Joshua addressed the Clifton family directly and said that he had done something horrible and that he was sorry, and despite the resentencing his sentence remained life in prison. Now with the provision that he would be entitled to a judicial review after 25 years, and that review process, which Joshua initiated in 2024 and 2025, has been opposed vigorously by Maddie's family, with her mother Sheila DeLongis and her sister Jessie both stating publicly that Maddie did not get a second chance, that Maddie did not get to grow up or graduate or fall in love or have a family, and that Maddie's sentence was final and her killers should be as well, and the hearing process was still ongoing as of the time of the script, with Joshua Phillips currently in his early 40s and still imprisoned in the Florida Department of Corrections, and Maddie Clifton, who was 8 years old and who crossed the road to ask her friend if he wanted to play baseball on an ordinary November afternoon, is remembered in Jacksonville through the ongoing presence of her case in the city's public memory and through the advocacy of her family, who have spent more than 25 years ensuring that the people with the power to decide Joshua Phillips' fate understand exactly what was lost on November 3, 1998. Number 9. Erin Caffey, the daughter who planned everything. The town of Alba, Texas has a population of just under 500 people, which means that in Alba everyone knows everyone else, everyone's business is to some degree everyone else's business, and the kind of family that the Caffeys were: devout, church-going, musical, with a father who was training for ministry and a mother who sang in the choir, and children who were homeschooled and raised with scripture at the center of their daily lives, was exactly the kind of family that a community like Alba understood and valued and held up as an example of the way things were supposed to be, which is part of what made the events of the early morning hours of March 1, 2008 so devastating, not just to the surviving members of the Caffey family but to the entire community, because what happened that night was not a crime that came from outside Alba or from outside the Caffey family, but a crime that was conceived and planned and executed from within, orchestrated by a 16-year-old girl named Erin Caffey, who had decided that her parents were standing between her and what she wanted and that the solution to that problem was their elimination. The Caffey family consisted of Terry Caffey, who was 41 years old in March 2008 and was actively pursuing his calling as a minister in the Miracle Faith Baptist Church, his wife Penny, who was 37, and their 3 children, of whom the eldest was Aaron, then 16, followed by Matthew, who was 13 and was called Bubba by his family, and Tyler, who was 8 years old, and the family lived in a cabin-style house outside Alba in Rains County and had made faith and family the twin pillars of everything they did, with all 3 children involved in church activities, Aaron singing in the youth choir with a passion that church members remembered as extraordinary, and the family being by all external accounts a tightly bound unit defined by shared values and genuine affection. The disruption to that picture began in the autumn of 2007, when Aaron took a part-time job serving at a local Sonic restaurant and met an 18-year-old named Charlie Wilkinson. And what began as a teenage romance escalated quickly into something that consumed Aaron's attention and began to change her behavior in ways that alarmed her parents, with her grades declining and her attitude shifting and her focus narrowing to the point where Charlie Wilkinson appeared to have become the organizing principle of her life. And when Terry and Penny went online to research the young man their daughter was spending so much time with, they found a social media presence that concerned them deeply, with references to alcohol and sexual content that were incompatible with the values they were raising their children to hold. And in February 2008, when Erin violated a phone curfew rule her parents had established, they made the decision to require her to end the relationship with Charlie completely, and that decision, intended to protect their daughter, set in motion the sequence of events that would end Penny Caffey's life and the lives of both her sons and come within moments of ending Terry Caffey's life as well. Because in the weeks following her parents' ultimatum, Erin began speaking to friends about wanting her family dead, statements that friends of Erin's later recalled as something they initially did not take seriously, assuming she was speaking in the frustrated hyperbole of teenage emotion rather than expressing a genuine intention. And among those friends was a former boyfriend of Erin's named Michael Washburn, who later told investigators that Erin had spoken to him about wanting her family eliminated even before she met Charlie Wilkinson, which suggested that the desire predated the romantic relationship that became its justification. And in the weeks before March 1, Erin worked with Charlie and his friend Charles Wade to plan an attack on the Caffey family home, with all subsequent accounts from the participants indicating that it was Erin who was the driving force behind the planning, Erin who specified the outcome she wanted, and Erin who responded to Charlie's reported suggestion that they simply run away together with a refusal, insisting that running away was not sufficient. And on the night of February 28 into the early morning hours of March 1, 2008, while Erin and Wade's girlfriend Bobby Johnson waited in a car parked down the road, Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade entered the Caffey family home, and what happened inside that house over the next period of time left Penny Caffey dead and Matthew dead and Tyler dead, and Terry Caffey, who had been shot 5 times, dragged himself out of the burning house, because Wilkinson and Wade had set the structure on fire to destroy evidence before leaving, and made it to a neighbor's property where he was able to call for help, and when investigators arrived, they found a scene of almost unimaginable devastation and began immediately reconstructing what had happened. And the first story Erin told when she was located was that she had been kidnapped from the home, that she had been taken against her will and had nothing to do with what happened to her family, and she told her maternal grandmother the same story, and she told her father the same story when they were reunited, Terry Caffey absorbing the additional shock of being told, while still in critical condition, that his daughter was a victim of the same people who had taken his wife and sons. And then the story began to fall apart as Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade, both of whom quickly understood that the evidence against them was overwhelming, began talking to investigators, and both pointed directly and specifically at Erin as the person who had conceived and planned the attack, and Bobby Johnson's account corroborated that Erin had been fully aware and participatory in the planning, and investigators found Erin in a mobile home where she had been hiding and brought her in, and the legal proceedings that followed resulted in Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade pleading guilty and receiving life sentences without the possibility of parole, with Terry Caffey himself, in an act of faith and forgiveness that many observers found remarkable, appearing before prosecutors and asking them not to seek the death penalty against the two men who had followed his daughter's instructions into his home and taken his family from him, stating his belief that their deaths would not restore what he had lost, and that his faith required him to extend the possibility of forgiveness even in these circumstances. And Erin Caffey was tried as an adult despite being 16 at the time of the crime and entered a guilty plea, receiving 2 life sentences plus an additional 25 years, with the structure of her sentence making her eligible for parole consideration at age 59, and Bobby Johnson received 40 years, and Erin Caffey has been incarcerated at the Texas Department of Corrections facility in Gatesville ever since, having been interviewed over the years in various documentary contexts in which she has acknowledged the events but maintained a version of her own involvement that many investigators and observers find inconsistent with the evidence and with the accounts of the other participants, and Terry Caffey, who survived 5 gunshot wounds and the loss of his wife and both his sons and the discovery that his surviving child was responsible for all of it, has rebuilt his life in the years since, remarrying and having children and devoting himself to a ministry of forgiveness and public speaking in which he visits schools and churches to share what he has experienced, describing the moment in which he found the strength to begin the process of forgiveness as coming from a piece of paper he found stuck to a tree after walking out of the hospital for the first time, a paper with a scripture verse that he took as a message about the sovereignty of God over even the worst things that can happen to a human being, and Penny Caffey, who sang in the church choir with a joy her congregation remembered for years afterward, and Matthew, who was 13 and whose last words were reportedly a cry of confusion addressed to the young man who was supposed to be his sister's boyfriend, and Tyler, who was 8 years old, are gone, and the community of Alba, which had known the Caffeys as one of its own, has had to carry that loss alongside everything else that makes up the life of a small town in East Texas. Number 10. Barry Loukaitis, the boy who walked into algebra class. On the morning of February 2, 1996, in Moses Lake, Washington, the school day at Frontier Middle School began 2 hours late because of unusually cold temperatures that had made waiting for school buses dangerous for students, and that 2-hour delay meant that a 14-year-old 8th grader named Barry Loukaitis spent an extended period alone in his family's home that morning, a home that was in that period defined by a marriage in the final stages of collapse, by a mother who was herself psychologically fragile and who had been speaking to Barry in the weeks before February 2nd about her own suicidal thoughts and about plans she had made to harm herself and his father's girlfriend if the divorce proceeded in certain ways, by a father who had left early for a restaurant he operated 60 miles away, and by the accumulated weight of years of bullying at Frontier Middle School where Barry had been targeted relentlessly for his physical appearance, his large feet, his studious habits, and the cowboy-style clothing he favored, and investigators who later examined Barry Loukaitis' bedroom found 28 books by Stephen King and noted that the book sitting on his nightstand on the morning of February 2nd was a novel called Rage, written by King under a pseudonym, in which a high school student who feels victimized by the educational system takes his classroom hostage at gunpoint, and the influence of that book and of other cultural elements Barry had absorbed in the months before February 2nd became a significant element of the subsequent legal proceedings and of the broader public conversation about what had driven a 14-year-old to do what he did. Barry Loukaitis gathered the weapons he had obtained, a hunting rifle and 2 handguns, and dressed himself on the morning of February 2nd in a manner that investigators later noted seemed to reflect an attempt to embody something he had seen in a film or a music video, and he walked to Frontier Middle School and made his way to his 5th period algebra class, and what happened in that classroom in the minutes that followed left 3 people dead and 1 person wounded and an entire community shattered in ways from which it has never fully recovered, because the teacher of that algebra class was 49-year-old Leona Cares, a mother of 4 who was known by students and colleagues as a warm and dedicated educator who loved her subject and loved her students, and she was the first person struck when Barry Loukaitis entered the room and opened fire, and among the students in that classroom were 14-year-old Manuel Vela Jr. and 14-year-old Arnold Fritz, both of whom were also struck and both of whom died from their injuries, and a 13-year-old student named Natalie Hintz was also wounded, and then a gym teacher named John Lane, who was in an adjacent area and heard what was happening, made the decision to enter the classroom, and what Lane did in the next moments is one of the most remarkable acts of individual courage in the documented history of school crises in America, because he approached Barry Loukaitis directly, speaking to him, attempting to de-escalate the situation, and ultimately physically confronted and disarmed the 14-year-old shooter, restraining him until police arrived, an act of bravery that investigators and law enforcement officials later said almost certainly prevented additional deaths, because Barry still had loaded weapons and had shown no indication of intending to stop, and John Lane received recognition for his actions but has also carried the weight of that day for the 30 years since, appearing at subsequent legal proceedings and speaking about the questions that have never left him, about why that day in that classroom, about what he wishes he had known or been able to do differently. And the legal proceedings that followed saw Barry Loukaitis charged as an adult and tried in Seattle rather than in Moses Lake in an effort to find a jury that had not been directly exposed to the events through personal proximity. And Barry presented an insanity defense at trial with psychiatric testimony arguing that his mental state at the time of the offense was so severely impaired by the combination of his home environment, his mother's psychological instability, and his own psychological condition that he should not be held fully criminally responsible. But the jury rejected the insanity defense and convicted Barry Loukaitis of murder and kidnapping in 1997, and the original sentencing imposed 2 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 205 years, reflecting the multiple charges arising from the events of February 2, 1996, and Barry Loukaitis entered the Washington state prison system as a convicted murderer at the age of 16, and has been there ever since. And the case returned to prominence in 2017 when the United States Supreme Court's ruling in Miller v. Alabama, which held that mandatory life sentences without parole for individuals who were under 16 at the time of their offense were unconstitutional, required that Barry's sentence be reconsidered, and a resentencing hearing was held on April 19, 2017 in Ephrata, Washington before Judge Michael Cooper, who had presided over the original case and came out of retirement specifically to handle the resentencing. And it was at that hearing that Barry Loukaitis, then 36 years old, spoke publicly for the first time about what he had done, having submitted a handwritten letter to the court the week before the hearing and then addressing the survivors and the families of victims directly in the courtroom, and he said that he was sorry for what he had done, that what he had done was weak and evil and senseless, that he had spent a long time not apologizing because he feared that apologizing after something so terrible would only add insult to injury, and that if that instinct had been wrong he was sorry for not having spoken sooner. And among those who addressed the court at the resentencing was Alice Fritz, the mother of Arnold. Fritz, who told the court that she had visited Barry Loukaitis in prison 5 years earlier and that she believed his remorse was genuine, and Victoria Kimball, the daughter of teacher Leona Cares, who said that she felt a deep hatred for the man who had taken her mother from her, the woman who loved teaching mathematics so much that she had died, as her daughter put it, with a piece of chalk in one hand and an eraser in the other, and John Lane was also there and spoke, saying that nobody could understand the experience of that day unless they had been in that room, and the judge imposed a new sentence of 189 years in prison, and Barry Loukaitis did not contest the sentence and waived his right to any future appeals, and he has been described by prison officials in the years since as a model inmate who has earned educational degrees including a college degree, who has worked as a teacher's aide, and who has continued to express remorse for the events of February 2, 1996, and Leona Cares, who died with a piece of chalk in her hand on a delayed school morning in Moses Lake, and Manuel Vela Jr. and Arnold Fritz, who were 14 years old and sitting in algebra class, are gone, and Natalie Hintz has carried a gunshot wound and everything that comes with it for 30 years, and the families of everyone in that classroom on February 2nd, 1996 have lived with the specific and permanent weight of what Barry Loukaitis brought into that room, and Moses Lake, Washington, which had never expected to be the location of something like this, was changed by what happened at Frontier Middle School in ways that no subsequent years have fully undone.